As human beings, we don't actually need that many things. But the things we need on a regular basis. We need oxygen. If you don't get air for several minutes, you'll suffocate and die. We need water. If you don't get water for several days, you'll dehydrate and die. In some climates, we need shelter to protect us from the elements, or we'll get hypothermia or heat stroke and die. We need food. If you don't get food for several weeks or several months, you'll die of starvation. After we've consumed food and water, you need to get rid of what you don't use for nourishment and hydration. We need sleep. If you don't get sleep for several years, you'll die. And finally, we need love. If you don't have close relationships with other people, your lifespan will be shortened. Those who don't have at least one close friend during adulthood tend to die about a decade sooner than those who do. So those are the things that we actually need. But while we all have about 7 needs in common, we all seem to want about 7,000 different things at any particular time. And sometimes we get our needs and our wants mixed up. If you don't believe me, count the number of times you hear a sentence started with "I need" in the next 24 hours. You might be surprised. We all want things, but we don't all want the same things. And that is a key to understanding human motivation. Some have tried to discover what motivates humans, thinking that there might be a set of universal motives that drives each of us to do what we do. And some, like Abraham Maslow, have discovered that some of us have some of these motives in common. Maslow suggested that human behavior is motivated by an innate desire to seek the attainment of a hierarchy of needs, and to do so in a particular order. First, by seeking the fulfillment of physiological needs, then our safety needs, and our love and belongingness needs. And then esteem, both from ourselves and from others, especially those in our tribe. And finally, once these needs are fulfilled, Maslow predicted that people will seek self-actualization. But people have been able to come up with plenty of counterexamples to prove that Maslow's hierarchy of needs does not always predict human behavior accurately. And history demonstrates that human beings don't always seek the attainment of these needs in a predictable order. Others, like Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, provided further insight into motivation with their self-determination theory. One of the sub-theories of self-determination theory, basic psychological needs theory, suggests that all humans share the desire for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And this basic needs theory shines light on 3 wants that many of us have in common. In his excellent book, Drive, Dan Pink uses slightly different terms, autonomy, mastery, and purpose, to translate self-determination theory to the masses. Deci and Ryan created a great theory, and Dan Pink wrote a great book, but whatever terms used, these 3 concepts don't fully and completely explain human motivation or predict human behavior. And that is because people don't always want the same things or prioritize their motives in the same way. And the theory doesn't always tell us what a particular person wants to master or with whom he wants to feel related. You see, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory look at motivation on a nomothetic level. That's a big word for looking at things in a population or group and then making generalizations. So in the absence of a grand and parsimonious theory, which can help us identify with absolute certainty what will motivate a given person in a given situation, what do? Well, one approach would be to look at motivation on an idiographic level, that is, considering the motives of particular people rather than people in general. The key to doing this effectively can be found in one of our basic human needs, relationships. If you have a relationship with someone, it is much easier to figure out what they want. The baseball player Yogi Berra was famously witty, and one of his most famous witticisms was, "You can learn a lot by observing." The point he was making was so obvious that it was comical, and it should be equally obvious and comical when I say, "You can learn a lot by asking," but it isn't. And that's why sometimes leaders are puzzled by the behavior of those that they lead. If you want to understand what motivates someone, and your need for understanding is not extremely urgent, build a relationship with that person, a trusting relationship, a friendship even, and then ask them. You can learn a lot about what motivates people by asking them what they want, especially if they trust you and they trust that you care about them. Motivation is one of the most perplexing subjects for leaders, especially sport coaches. And coaches often lament that their players just aren't motivated. And sometimes when coaches figure out what I do for a living, sports psychology, they'll sometimes ask me to come to their practices and motivate their players. But that's not really how motivation works. The deepest motives are not things that can be given to players or forced upon them, especially not through punishing them with physical activity and embarrassing them with personal attacks. Players come to the field with their own motivation, that is, their own motives. If they're part of your program, there's at least one reason why they turned out for the team and they attend practices and they show up for games, whether it's internal or external. And for coaches, it can be very helpful to know their players well enough to know what motivates each of their players. As a tennis coach, I had one player who desperately wanted to earn a letter to put on his Letterman jacket. This was his primary motive, and he made this motive crystal clear to me. But I got to know him and I began to understand his family situation well enough to know that the deeper motive was that he wanted to earn his father's approval. He wanted his father to be proud of him. And I used that knowledge to help that player get closer to reaching his potential as a tennis player. And by the way, in small ways, I also tried to get his focus off of approval seeking and focus more on becoming the best that he could be. He ended up earning his letter during his junior year, and in so doing, he helped his team win some matches. When I first started teaching tennis lessons, I assumed everyone had the same primary motive: to develop their tennis abilities so that they could beat opponents in tournaments and competitions. And I'd sometimes get frustrated when some of the children and adults that I taught just didn't seem motivated. But then I had an epiphany. And it happened while I was talking with one of my adult clients who mentioned that she wanted to pay me in cash, which was a little weird, but everyone's got to earn a living, right? Anyway, she wanted to pay me in cash for the tennis lessons so that her husband wouldn't find out she was taking tennis lessons. You see, her motivation to get better at tennis was to develop her abilities so that she could compete with her husband, who didn't take her seriously as a potential tennis partner. And it seemed like on a deeper level, she maybe felt that her husband didn't respect her as a person. So her motivation had nothing to do with competing against anonymous opponents in USTA competitions. For other players, motivation had nothing to do with competition whatsoever. I had one client who took tennis lessons so that she and her husband could sustain longer rallies and get more exercise while they were doing something that they both enjoyed. So for her, getting cardiovascular exercise in a fun way while spending quality time with her husband, those were her motives. So when I tried to help her hit ground strokes more consistently, she was excited to learn. But if I tried to teach her advanced tactics and competition strategy, I probably would have wondered why she just wasn't motivated, had I not gotten to know her. After I had this epiphany, I became a better coach. I became intentional about building relationships with people I was working with, and I tried to figure out where they wanted to go and how I could use my teaching abilities to help them get there. It is much easier to lead someone to a place where they want to go in the first place. And you usually don't know where they want to go until you ask them. So this is key. If you want someone to be motivated, you need to figure out what motivates them, and then use that knowledge to help them get where they want to go. And remember that you don't usually know what motivates someone until you get to know that person. And if you try to motivate a person that you don't know, you're just kind of guessing. Take the guesswork out of your leadership by getting to know your people and asking them what they want. If you think this all sounds a little too warm and fuzzy, read interviews with Pete Carroll in the lead up to the Seattle Seahawks victory in Super Bowl 43. He repeatedly mentions the importance of not only knowing his players as individuals, but appreciating them as individuals. For leaders like Pete Carroll who do this, there is often an added bonus. In addition to better understanding the motives of those you lead, their followers might even acquire a new motive. In addition to playing to please themselves, they might also play to please their leader. People usually like to be known, and they like to be treated as ends in themselves rather than means to the leader's ends. Getting to know people and getting to know what makes them tick is a great way to obtain valuable information. But it's also a great way to show people that you care. And as John Wooden liked to say, they don't care what you know until they know that you care. If you care about succeeding as a leader, take the time to really care for your followers and understand what they care about. And remember that you'll probably never know what they really want until you ask them.